So Lukas is going to talk about quantifying and mapping coarse woody debris using airborne laser scanning. And Lukas is a master's student at UBC, I believe.
Yep, I assume everyone can see my slide good?
Yep, I can see it.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thank you for attending today, everybody. I'm going to be talking about one of my more recent projects, which focuses on quantifying and mapping coarse woody debris using airborne laser scanning. So a quick overview of what some of the things I'm going to go over. I'm going to talk about what coarse woody debris actually is and why it's important. I'll go over my study area a little bit and how I collected my data, the actual processing strategy that I went through to detect the coarse woody debris, and then I'll go over my results, and then how I expanded these results to make a few maps of my study area that show kind of where the coarse woody debris is and how much there is. So to start, what is coarse woody debris and why does it matter? So it's a little bit more than just logs on the ground. So every tree that's grown up in a forest stand will eventually fall over, whether that's from old age or a disturbance of some sort. It then falls on the forest floor and becomes part of the forest ecosystem. And these big fallen logs on the ground can actually reflect the history of the stand, a little bit of insight into the stand conditions, namely the species composition, what successional stage the forest is in, any past disturbances that may have disturbed this particular stand. Coarse woody debris is also important for carbon sequestration. It's actually one of the 5 main pools that are required by the UN when you're doing carbon accounting. So it's really useful to figure out how much coarse woody debris you have and therefore how much carbon is contained within it. It's also very important for wildfire fuel management because all these big dead logs lying on the forest floor is essentially kindling for wildfires, which especially in the past few years with the climate changing, we've seen a huge increase in both frequency and severity of wildfires here in Western North America. So being able to map these both in quantity and location can help forest managers allocate their resources and know what areas are more susceptible to these high severity fires. And lastly, coarse woody debris is also important for wildlife habitat. A lot of animals use it as shelter, as well as certain plants use these fallen logs as nurse logs where they sit on top of them and dig their roots in and use these logs as nutrients to help get an advantage in the competitive forest environment. So a little bit about airborne laser scanning. It's just airborne LiDAR basically on a plane, which gives us spatially explicit information over broad landscapes. An example is shown over here on the left. You can see the point cloud is quite detailed. You can see a lot of trees. And then if you look at the profile view on the bottom, you can see there is still a lot of points that reach the forest floor. Airborne laser scanning is time efficient and a relatively cost-effective procedure. And in the past, it's already been used to predict forest structural attributes, including canopy structure, successional stages, understory biomass, as well as standing dead trees. So this is what I'm really looking to expand on. Is moving from these standing dead trees to the horizontal dead trees that are on the forest floor and trying to quantify and map them. So a little bit about my study area. It's in Deception Lake, which is near Smithers, British Columbia. You can see in this map here, it's kind of in the northwestern part of the province. The area is dominated by subalpine fir, interior spruce, and lodgepole pine. And across the area, I have a density of 23 points per meter squared, which is fairly dense. And the study area is actually quite large and contains a lot of different forest structure, from stands that were harvested 20 years ago to ones that were harvested 100 years ago, and even some that are still left untouched. So I wanted to try to capture as much variation in standing conditions that I could. So I used a structurally guided sampling approach, which gave me 28 plots and 14 unique structural classes, which allowed me to capture a good amount of this variation. I'm going to talk a little bit about my actual measurements. So for each plot, there was this 10 by 10 meter gray square, which inside I recorded all the pieces of coarse woody debris that I saw. So this is an example of one of my field maps. You can see the pieces of coarse woody debris labeled there. And for each piece, I measured the diameter at both ends, as well as the elevation at both ends, the overall length within the plot. And I also gave them a bark decay class and organic growth class. This was kind of to help age the coarse woody debris and see if some of the more decayed ones were more difficult to detect. I also drew in shrubs and trees, so when I'm looking for these logs in the point cloud, I have a little bit of a reference point to understand why some of them might be completely covered by a shrub, so you don't have as good of a chance of detecting it. So now moving on to my actual processing strategy. It was essentially a 5-point strategy where I first focused on plot refinement and then height thresholds. And then I went on picking the most appropriate ground classification algorithm, then on to trying to remove the vegetation that still exists on the forest floor level, like the understory. And then finally, I moved on to linear feature extraction and actually digitizing these points into line segments that we could measure and quantify, and then eventually map. So the first step was plot refinement. So all the literature surrounding coarse woody debris and LiDAR detection shows that it's very reliant on pulse density. This is mainly due to vegetation cover being a known limitation. So the more vegetation that's over it, the less ALS pulses are going to actually reach the forest floor and interact with those pieces of coarse woody debris. So if there's super high vegetation cover, we're not going to get any points touching the logs, and it's going to be very difficult to map them. So my approach to surpassing this was based on a paper by Joyce et al. In 2019, who looks at also detecting coarse woody debris with ALS, but they did it in just manually looking at a point cloud. And they recommended a minimum pulse density of 7 pulses per meter squared, under 2 meters. This is because they found that they detected more than 50% of the logs at that pulse density. So I went away and used this basically as my baseline. And this brought my original number of plots down from 28 to 16, but that still left plenty of logs. So the next step was establishing point cloud thresholds. So this is basically looking at a profile view of the point cloud and figuring out which height strata I want to look and try to identify these pieces of coarse woody debris. So the upper threshold was fairly easy. I just used 1 meter. That was pretty common in the literature. And it's also very uncommon for a log to be that's fallen down to be higher than 1 meter. So that one was fairly easy. But the second one, the lower threshold, I established as 0.3 meters, also based off of the Joyce et al. Paper, who found that detection probability surpassed 50% with logs that were 30 centimeters in diameter or greater. So since I'm only looking for these 30 centimeters in diameter or greater large logs, that's why I set my lower threshold at. So in total, this gave me 28 logs that I was aiming to detect over 16 plots. And these larger 30 centimeter logs are also the most important for wildlife habitat, and they consisted of 79% of my total plot volume. So the next step was establishing a proper ground point classification. So I chose to use the cloth simulation filter, which is kind of demonstrated on the right here. So if you can imagine, the blue line is the LiDAR points. It essentially flips the point cloud upside down, and the red line represents a simulated cloth. And anything that deviates too far from the cloth, like this house wood or tree, it kind of simulates the ground to be there and makes the house or tree stand out a lot more. So I set my grounding threshold at 0.3 based on my lower point cloud threshold. And basically what this does is anything below 0.3 meters, it will revalue to 0, which makes anything 0.3 meters above stand out quite a bit more. So my hope here was to make the coarse woody debris returns stand out from everything else that's going on the ground. And the example shown in this image in the bottom left is one of my plots. And this is just the normal grounding algorithm. And you can kind of see there appears to be some sort of linear feature here, but it's not super defined and it's hard to pick out from the rest of the noise. But when I apply the cloth simulation filter, we actually see those logs become much more apparent and they're standing out and there's much less noise thanks to the grounding algorithm. We can even see a couple extra ones over here and down here. So this moves me to the fourth step, which is vegetation removal. So this image here is the same one you saw on the previous slide, but unfortunately, returns still exist here that are not coarse woody debris, and it's largely due to vegetation. So my approach to get rid of this was going off the idea that with LiDAR, coarse woody debris will not have multiple returns where shrubs and other vegetation might. So when a pulse comes down from the airplane, certain structures like vegetation and leaves, the pulse will actually pass through it and go down and hit something else on the ground, another leaf, or maybe actually the ground. So it's possible that those pulses will have multiple returns, where when it hits a piece of coarse woody debris, it's not going to go through it. It's just going to return straight back. So using this idea, I set a threshold where I only where I removed all the multiple returns under 2 meters, which aim to get rid of all that vegetation. And the result is shown here on the right, where those logs have become much more apparent and there's a lot less noise surrounding them. So from here, it was a lot easier to go away and actually digitize these and make them into measurable line segments, which is my last step here. The example is shown in this photo. I used a binary linear classification algorithm, which is in the LiDAR package of within our studio. So these red dots here represent each of the points that this classification deemed as linear. So I then took all the linear points and put them through a vectorization process that basically buffers them and creates center lines and turns them into like line shape files. And for each of these shape files, there's also an associated height from the LiDAR points. And I use the average height for each line segment as a proxy for diameter. So for each line segment that I detected, I have a length as well as a diameter, which allowed me to go away and calculate a volume. So an example for this square plot here, the brown lines are the field map ones that I drew on the ground. And then the red lines are the ALS detected ones. So you can see it actually worked pretty well. Sometimes it was a little bit short on them, and I got a little bit confused when logs would cross over each other. But for the most part, it was very successful. And we detected 18 of the 28 coarse-woody debris logs for 64%, which is really good comparative to the other literature that's going on at the moment. A little bit about my results. This graph here is kind of just showing which log features affect detection. So using a logistic regression, comparing the missed logs to the detected ones, I found that average diameter, maximum diameter, or length didn't really affect detection too much, but the average height above the ground made detection significantly more effective. You can see the logs that are considerably more off the ground were detected much more often. And lastly, the growth and bark classes. Growth class 0 and 1, which represent logs that have no growth or very minimal growth on them, essentially logs that are recently fallen, were detected 74% of the time compared to a lot less for the older, more decayed logs. And we see a similar pattern in bark class, where class 3 represents logs that still have all their bark, or class 2 where they're most of their bark. So again, these are the newly fallen logs that are detected much more compared to the other ones. And so my actual results at the plot level, since I was able to calculate coarse-woody debris volume, I summed that for each plot, and we saw a strong correlation between the predicted volume for the plot and then the observed volume. We see minor overestimation at the low end here, and then underestimation at the high end. But the important takeaway is that the plots that actually had the most coarse-woody debris were predicted as such, and the plots that didn't were also predicted as such. So from this, I was able to go away and actually create a map of my study area. So this is 4 of the forest stands located within my study area. And in these forest stands, since coarse-woody debris is so troublesome to actually go into the field and measure each piece, we don't have any validation data for it. So instead, I wanted to run my algorithm over these forest stands and see if it followed the ecological literature that would suggest where more coarse-woody debris would be present. So with this stand here, it's dominated by lodgepole pine. It's my youngest stand by far, and it's also the shortest in the canopy height. And we see that there's very little coarse-woody debris comparatively to the other ones. So this actually makes sense because this stand is a little bit younger. It hasn't had time to grow up and for the trees to fall over and become coarse-woody debris on the ground. This isn't compared to the top 2 stands there, which are a little bit taller, a little bit older, and so they're naturally more developed. And we're starting to see more coarse-woody debris, which is what we would expect. And lastly, this one on the bottom is by far the oldest stand and the tallest, and it also has a dominant species of subalpine fir and interior spruce, which is the climax species for this region. So it's by far the most developed stand and where we would expect to see the most coarse-woody debris. And we did see it there, so that was very encouraging. So my conclusions from this work is that coarse-woody debris can be successfully delineated and mapped using ALS, and that average height can indeed be used for a proxy, especially at the plot level. The detection is hindered by the age. Older pieces of wood are harder to detect, and the more elevated the coarse-woody debris off the ground is, the easier it is to detect. And then a quick overview of the limitations. It's basically the minimum pulse density that I used of 7 points per meter squared. The more dense your LiDAR data is, the less this becomes a factor. And I acknowledge that I only accounted for coarse woody debris 30 centimeters in diameter or more. That was most of the volume, but there are a few logs beneath that that could be important that I just didn't account for. And lastly, for future research, I think coarse woody debris detection could be expanded into streams, mainly because there's less vegetation cover, so the pulse density is not as important. And coarse woody debris is important habitat for fish. That's well established. And then I also think that it could be expanded into other forest types with different amounts of understory vegetation cover. And lastly, I think there's additional linear detection algorithms that are coming out in the future that might work a little bit better than the one I used in the LiDAR package, which could hopefully improve these models moving forward. And I'd just like to thank all my funding partners for this and everyone at UBC that has helped me along with this project. And I will now be taking questions.
Thank you, Lukas. That was really interesting. I don't see any questions in the chats. Let's wait a few seconds. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions, but I can tell you that in New Brunswick, there are no tree stands that are 165 years old. That's crazy. Let alone 90. I don't think we even have those that are 90 years old. So no, that's super cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting research. I don't see any. Yeah, Fiona Gregory of Alberta. You're literally finding the needle in the haystack. I'm amazed this works. Yeah, for sure. Roger Wheat, can you distinguish fallen logs resting on other logs / suspended from CWD?
Yeah, so when logs are falling on the other logs, they tend to be over that 1 meter height threshold that I put on. They're actually easier to distinguish, and the line detection algorithm picks them up a lot more. I just found that when I set my height threshold higher than 1 meter, you would get a lot of small trees, which kind of mess it up a little bit more. But especially if you're in a relatively sparse understory, that would be very easy to do. It's just not really what I was focusing on for this particular project. And whoever just asked about the other detection algorithms, the big one is the hue transformation algorithm that just came out. There's actually a paper that came out like a few weeks ago. I've submitted this to Forest Science at the moment, and it's in review. And they came out with a pretty similar one using the hue transformation strategy, which I think would also work pretty well, and it seemed to.